There is a date that appears in 3 separate documents I found in 3 separate archives on 2 separate continents. The documents are unrelated to each other by any official cataloging system. One is a maintenance ledger from a municipal utility office in St. Louis, Missouri. One is a shipping manifest from a port authority in Hamburg, Germany. One is an internal memorandum from a regional administrative office in Omsk, Western Siberia. They were produced by different institutions, in different languages, for entirely different bureaucratic purposes. No historian has ever connected them. No academic database links them. They sit in their respective archives, misfiled or under-catalogued, accessible to anyone patient enough to look. The date that appears in all 3 is November 14th. The St. Louis Ledger records the decommissioning of what it describes as a primary atmospheric collection node, listed as a maintenance item, marked as permanently closed, no explanation given for the closure. The Hamburg Manifest records the shipment of resonance equipment components to an unspecified government facility. The items described as salvage from multiple unnamed source locations across Europe. The Omsk Memorandum, the most extraordinary of the 3, refers in passing to the cessation order as a known agreed-upon event, discussing only its administrative consequences, as if the order itself required no explanation to its intended reader. 3 documents, 3 countries, 1 date. Something was turned off on November 14th, something that operated simultaneously across St. Louis, Hamburg, and Omsk, something significant enough to require coordinated administrative processing across multiple continents, and obscure enough that no mainstream historical record has ever named it directly. I believe it was a power grid, not the kind we use today, not wires and substations and coal-fired generators feeding current through copper lines to individual buildings. Something older, something that operated through a different principle entirely. Something that the civilization we now call Tartaria built into the landscape itself, and that the civilization that replaced it used for 50 years before deciding, in a single coordinated night, to shut it down permanently. To understand what was switched off, you first have to understand what the 19th century's relationship with electricity actually looked like. Not the version taught in physics classes, but the version visible in the photographs, the patents, the engineering disputes, and the architectural evidence that mainstream history has absorbed without fully processing. The official story of electrical development runs in a clean line: Franklin's kite, Volta's battery, Faraday's electromagnetic induction, Edison's direct current system, Tesla's alternating current system, the war of currents in the 1880s and 1890s, and the eventual global adoption of the AC grid we inherited. It is a story of individual genius, commercial competition, and incremental technological progress. It is, like most official stories, partially true and strategically incomplete. What the official story omits is the existence, documented in patents, engineering papers, and eyewitness accounts from the 1850s through the 1890s, of a parallel electrical tradition, one that operated not through wire transmission, but through what its practitioners described as atmospheric conduction. The principle, articulated most clearly by Nikola Tesla in his later and most suppressed work, proposed that the Earth itself functioned as a conductor, that electrical energy could be transmitted through the planet's own electromagnetic field without any physical medium connecting source to receiver. A generator at one location could produce energy that appeared usably at a receiver anywhere on the planet. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, constructed on Long Island between 1901 and 1917 and demolished in 1917 at the order of the United States government, was the most visible attempt to implement this principle within the official historical record. But Tesla's papers, many of which were seized by the Office of Alien Property immediately after his death in 1943 and have never been fully released, suggest that Wardenclyffe was not an invention. It was a reconstruction. Tesla was not creating a new system. He was attempting to reverse engineer one that had already existed. The evidence for a pre-existing atmospheric transmission system is architectural before it is technological. The buildings attributed to Tartarian civilization and the near-identical buildings that appear across North America, Western Europe, and Russia throughout the 19th century share a structural feature that conventional architectural history explains as ornamental: the dome. Every major civic building of the period has one. Courthouses in Kansas, administrative offices in St. Petersburg, train stations in Vienna, government halls in Philadelphia. This is not decoration. This is an antenna array. The copper dome collects atmospheric electrical charge. The stone foundation, particularly where it contacts groundwater, provides a ground connection. The building between them is not merely a civic space, it is a functional component in a transmission and distribution system that uses the building's physical mass as part of its operating infrastructure. The ornamental language, the finials, the lightning rods positioned at specific intervals, the metallic elements integrated into carved stone facades, is not aesthetic, it is functional. Every element serves the system. Once you see this, you cannot look at a 19th century building any other way. I've mapped the distribution of domed civic buildings across North America from the period 1850 to 1900. The pattern is not random, and it is not explained by the distribution of wealth or political importance. The buildings are spaced at intervals that suggest network logic, approximately 40 to 60 miles between major nodes, with smaller receiver structures at shorter intervals between them. The spacing is consistent across regions that had no coordinated architectural planning, designed by architects who had no known contact with each other, funded by institutions with entirely different bureaucratic priorities. You do not independently arrive at the same network spacing unless you are building to a pre-existing plan, and the plan, I believe, was not drawn by any 19th century architect, it was inherited. The buildings that appear to have been constructed in the 1850s through 1880s were not built to create the network. They were built around a network that was already in the ground, connections, conduits, and resonance structures that predated any documented 19th century construction, and that the new buildings were designed to interface with. The World's Fairs become comprehensible in this context. The extraordinary illumination documented at fair after fair, the coordinated electric light that made the 1893 White City visible for miles, that turned the 1901 Buffalo Tower into a beacon seen from distances that contemporary transmission technology cannot explain, was not produced by the generators and wiring that the official records describe. It was produced by the atmospheric system. The fairs were located on nodes in the existing network. The construction of the fairs was, in significant part, the clearing and restoration of existing infrastructure, and the electricity that lit them came from the same source that had been lighting Tartarian civilization for generations before the event that buried it. The generators documented in fair records were real. The wiring was real, but they were supplementary, visible evidence of a conventional electrical system that could be pointed to, explained, and later removed. The actual power source was invisible, undocumented, and built into the site. When the fairs were demolished, the surface infrastructure was removed, the underground network remained, and somewhere, in a decision that required coordination across multiple countries and multiple institutional frameworks, a date was chosen to shut it down. November 14, 1899. I want to be precise about why I believe the shutdown was a decision, rather than a failure. Systems fail gradually. Components degrade at different rates. An organic technical failure across a global network would produce a pattern of regional outages, documented engineering responses, gradual loss of capacity over months or years. What the archival evidence suggests, and the three documents I began with, are only the clearest examples of a broader pattern, is that the cessation was simultaneous and complete. There was no degradation period. There was an order, and then there was silence. The timing is significant. By 1899, the war of currents between Edison's direct current system and Tesla's alternating current system had been effectively decided in favor of AC. The institutional and commercial infrastructure of the modern electrical grid was being laid. The companies, the patents, the regulatory frameworks and the investment structures that would govern electrical power for the next century were coalescing around a model of wire transmission, a model that required physical infrastructure, created geographic dependency, and generated continuous revenue through metered consumption. An atmospheric transmission system that delivered free energy to any receiver within range of the network was incompatible with this model. Not technically incompatible, the two systems could have coexisted, commercially incompatible. A population with access to free atmospheric electricity had no need to purchase metered current from a wire-based utility. The emerging electrical industry required the elimination of the competing system, not because the competing system was inferior, but because its continued operation made the commercial model impossible. Someone did the calculation. Someone looked at the atmospheric network, the buildings that interfaced with it, the population that used it without understanding its origin, and decided that its commercial threat outweighed whatever historical or humanitarian obligation might have argued for its preservation. And someone, operating through channels that left only the faintest traces in 3 misfiled documents across 2 continents, gave the order. The mechanism of the shutdown is the hardest element to reconstruct, because it required technical knowledge of the system that the people who executed the order may not have fully possessed. What the documents suggest, and here I am reading between lines that were never meant to be connected, is that the network had a small number of critical resonance points whose deactivation would cascade through the entire system. These were not random locations. They were the highest amplitude nodes in the network, the sites where the atmospheric charge was most efficiently collected and the transmission most powerful. Several of these sites were World's Fair locations. The deliberate construction of conventional electrical systems at these sites, the generators, the wiring, the substations, may have served a dual purpose. Publicly, it provided the extraordinary illumination that made the fairs spectacular. Privately, it allowed technicians access to the network nodes under the cover of legitimate electrical work. The decommissioning of the node infrastructure, recorded in documents like the St. Louis Maintenance Ledger as routine utility work, was the physical implementation of the shutdown order. The fairs ended. The conventional systems were removed. The node infrastructure was decommissioned, and the network that had operated across the entire surface of the Northern Hemisphere for an indeterminate period before the 19th century went dark. What happened to the people who understood how it worked? This is the question I find myself least equipped to answer and most compelled to ask. The Tartarian network was not a spontaneous natural phenomenon. It was engineered, designed, installed, maintained, and presumably operated by individuals who understood its principles. Those individuals, or their institutional descendants, existed somewhere in the 19th century. The buildings were being maintained. The system was producing usable power. Someone knew how it worked, even if that knowledge had been partially fragmented by whatever catastrophe buried the civilization that originally built it. The suppression of Tesla is the most visible data point. Tesla's understanding of atmospheric transmission was not theoretical. It was practical, detailed, and sufficiently advanced that he was able to design a reconstruction of the system's transmission principles from what appear to have been fragmentary sources. His correspondence, the portions that have been released, refers repeatedly to prior work, to transmission principles that he describes as having been previously demonstrated and historically implemented without specifying by whom. He was not inventing, he was recovering. The destruction of Wardenclyffe Tower in 1917 was funded by Tesla's creditors and executed under circumstances that have never been fully explained. The official reason that the tower's steel was needed for wartime scrap is implausible on its face. A single tower's steel contribution to the war effort was negligible. The tower was destroyed because its operation, even in its incomplete and underfunded state, was producing results that the established electrical industry could not afford to have publicly demonstrated. J.P. Morgan, who had funded and then withdrawn funding from the Wardenclyffe project, understood exactly what a functional atmospheric transmission demonstration would mean for the metered current business model he had invested in building. Tesla died in 1943, alone in a hotel room in New York. His papers were seized within hours of his death. The Office of Alien Property, a wartime agency, took custody of documents that, by any reasonable classification, had nothing to do with enemy alien property. They were held for decades. Some were released, many were not. The released documents show a scientist at the end of his life, still working on atmospheric transmission, still convinced that the system he was attempting to rebuild had functioned before, still using language that suggests he understood he was reconstructing something rather than inventing something. The buildings remain the most democratic evidence, accessible to anyone willing to look. Walk through any major 19th century civic building in any American or European city and pay attention to the copper. Pay attention to where it is, how it is connected, how it moves through the building's structure from roof to foundation. Pay attention to the dome and what it connects to. Pay attention to the spacing of the metallic ornamental elements and what network they imply when mapped against similar elements in similar buildings in neighboring cities. The ornament is not ornament, it is circuitry. The buildings are not monuments, they are components, and the system they were components of operated at a scale and efficiency that the wire-based grid we built to replace it has never matched and was never designed to match. I have stood in a courthouse in Missouri, built according to its foundation stone in 1882, and looked at the copper dome from the inside. The dome is connected to a series of vertical copper elements that run down through the building's interior walls in a pattern that no conventional electrical or plumbing requirement explains. These elements disappear into the foundation. The foundation, according to renovation documents I accessed through a public records request, extends 22 feet below the building's ground floor, into bedrock, far deeper than any load-bearing requirement for a 4-story stone structure would demand. The building went up in 1882. The atmospheric network shut down in 1899. For 17 years, this courthouse in Missouri was a functioning node in a power distribution system that nobody who worked there understood, that no document officially described, and that continued operating silently beneath the administrative routines of county government until the night someone gave the order and the current stopped flowing. What did they notice? Did anyone notice? Did the men working late in that building on the night of November 14, 1899, feel anything change? Did some quality of the air alter? Some subtle warmth or resonant hum that they had never consciously registered? I don't know. The documents don't record that kind of thing. They record decommissioning orders and shipping manifests and administrative memoranda. They record the institutional processing of an event whose human dimension was never considered worth preserving. What I know is that by 1900, the atmospheric network was gone. By 1910, Tesla's funding was gone. By 1917, his tower was gone. By 1943, his papers were taken. And the metered current grid that replaced the atmospheric system had become so thoroughly embedded in every aspect of modern life that the idea of a prior system, older, cleaner, more efficient, freely distributed, had come to seem not merely improbable, but literally unimaginable. That is not a coincidence of technological history. That is the successful completion of a project that began on November 14, 1899, in the offices of men whose names the documents don't record, who gave an order that the documents describe only in its consequences, who understood precisely what they were eliminating and chose to eliminate it anyway. The copper domes are still there. You can see them from any elevated point in any old American or European city, gleaming green with oxidation above the rooflines, connected to foundations that go deeper than they need to, spaced across the landscape at intervals that make no architectural sense and perfect network sense. They are the fingerprints of a system too large to completely erase. The order that shut it down could silence the current. It could demolish Wardenclyffe and seize Tesla's papers and decommission the nodes one by one across 2 continents. It could ensure that no school curriculum ever described what the buildings were actually for, and that no architectural history text ever asked why the ornament was always copper and always connected and always grounded into bedrock. But it could not tear down every dome on every courthouse in every county seat in America. It could not remove every finial and every metallic element from every civic building that had been integrated into the network across a century of use. It could not erase the spacing from the landscape, or the depth from the foundations, or the pattern from the distribution of nodes across the map. The evidence is still there. The system is still there, dormant, waiting, its components maintained as historic architecture, its network preserved in the very buildings that house the institutions that decided it should never be understood. Someone gave the order on November 14th. The buildings are still asking why.